you want to offer prayer for us?
Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for another day of life. And Lord, how we need these wonderful words of life in our hearts. We pray that as we open your word, Father, your holy angels may encompass us, that we may be given the heavenly oil that will give us the understanding we need to place these things line upon line, to calibrate our minds, to be in tune with thee. We thank you for this day, and we ask for your blessing and your mercy in Jesus' name. Amen.
Well, good morning again.
Good morning.
We're going to be studying the Exodus. And as such, we're going to be looking at the Passover. And the Passover is really important as we move forward in understanding Samuel Snow's letters and the events in 1844, also the commencement of the 2300 days and the 70 weeks in 457. So there are many details that we're going to have to skip over. And if you think about the Exodus and the Passover in general, this is a huge topic. It's a topic that there's a great deal of debate about, not just within Christendom as a whole, but even within Adventism in this movement, and how to place the Passover. There are Adventist scholars who do all kinds of crazy things to try to correct our understanding of the start of the 2300 days, when Jesus was crucified. And we can't address everything. So what we're going to do is we're going to try to lay it out the way that I understand it. And we can't deal with every point. We can't hammer down every point or nail down every point. But there are some things we're going to have to discuss. So obviously, this is a discussion as well. It's not just me telling you what I've found. But we need to be careful in how we do that. And, if there are some things that I really am missing out, we might have to spend some time, outside of this study and trying to look at that, if there's something that you think I'm missing. Now, the first thing we're looking at in the Exodus, so if you go to your notes, page 21, we're looking at this fourth generation. So we have the fourth generation, and there's a couple of points I think that are important, because we know the Exodus is a reform line. And here, the Israelites went down into Egypt when Jacob was 130 years old, and it says they're going to come out in the fourth generation. So the fourth generation is marked by, if you're going to count the fourth generation of 12 sons, which son are you going to choose to count the generations? Because even though we think of generations as, your descendants, are all the 12 sons going to start their families at the same time? Are they going to have their children that they have, are they going to start their families at the same time? We could probably find that maybe there's some lines of some of the 12 sons of Jacob that have 5 generations up into the Exodus. And when it says they come out in the fourth generation, we will find that there's probably people in the 5th generation that are there, maybe even in the 6th generation. So the question is, how would we count this 4th generation? So does anybody have ideas how we end the 4th generation? Then maybe that can help us to figure out how we count it. So how do we mark the 4th generation in the story here of these 4 generations? Does anybody know? Okay, so Moses is born. So here we have the birth of Moses. So this is how we generally think of it. Moses is born, and this starts the 4th generation. But is Moses the oldest son? Yeah. So technically then, who would start the beginning of the fourth generation? Aaron. And how much older is Aaron than Moses? 3 years, right? So here you have the birth of Aaron. So this is the time of the end. This is the fourth generation. Do you see that? So one of the things that I showed last year is that the time of the end and the fourth generation don't start at the same time. The fourth generation always precedes the time of the end. And there's always a period of darkness. Now, one of the things that happens with Moses, what happens with Moses that shows that we're in a period of darkness? What happens when Moses is born? Okay, does this happen when Aaron is born? Is Aaron's life threatened by being killed by Pharaoh? So something happens from the time of Aaron to the time of Moses, so that when Moses is born, they have to hide him. Right? So that means the darkness here specifically has to do with what? What is the darkness then? For those who were at the worship last night, the prayer meeting, I asked that the darkness relates to the reform line. So what's the darkness here? Any ideas? Because Moses is threatened. So the Israelites are being persecuted by the Egyptians. So this darkness relates to the challenges against God's people. Does that make sense? And this reform line answers who God's people are. Does that make sense? So who is Jehovah, right? Who is the Lord? We get to find out who the Lord is. And God's people, the Israelites, are now being put to death. The babies are being killed when they're born at the time that Moses is born. Does that make sense, or am I making that clear? Does anybody? Okay. We have this reform line of the Exodus demonstrates who God's people are. And what's being challenged in this period of darkness is who God's people are. That is, Pharaoh does not recognize Jehovah or the Israelites as being God's people. Right?
Because he's persecuting them.
He's persecuting them, right? And so this reform line answers to that. Now, when we have a time of the end, obviously there's a prophecy that is marking. So we know that the fourth generation begins here, and we know we have a 215-year period here that ends with the Exodus, right? Which we place as 1533 BC, or 2513 AM, right? That's how we've marked that. Now, the generations then, Aaron is a descendant of who? Who's he a descendant of? Levi. He's from the tribe of Levi. So the first generation here is Levi. And then Levi's son is, anybody know? Kohath. And then Amram. And I guess we would put this here. We'll do it like this. We'll put Amram and Aaron. Yeah. Yeah. So this is the first generation, second, third, fourth, and this is still in the fourth generation. So this reform line occurs in the fourth generation. But people of the fifth and the sixth generation could still be alive at the time they come out. So when it says that they shall come out in the fourth generation is begun with the birth of Aaron. How old is Aaron when the Exodus occurs?
83.
Yeah, he's 83 years old. So you see what I'm saying in trying to understand this as being the fourth generation. God calls this the fourth generation even though it's 83 years after the fourth generation has begun. right? So the argument that somehow the generations have to be, this is the time of the end, has to be the beginning of the fourth generation, to me is a weak argument, because here in this reform line we can see that this is still the fourth generation. Because Aaron marks the beginning of the fourth generation, and Aaron is here. Okay? Yeah, I don't know if I'd use the word that's progressive, but the thing is the fourth generation has begun. Even though the fifth and sixth generation has begun, God still says it's the fourth generation. And that's the main point I want to place there. So, any questions on that point?
It would be because that reformer is raised up in the fourth generation?
Yeah. Yeah, well, Moses comes in the fourth generation.
So that's why you call it the fourth generation.
And so it's still the fourth generation. Does it matter that there is other generations that happen to be there at the time of the Exodus? Nathan, you had
A couple of more examples of what you said, that the time of the end and what proceeds for addresses the darkness beforehand.
Okay, so the question relating to the reform line, I've presented this before, but I don't think people usually think about it. So when we have a reform line is always a response to the period of darkness. And that period of darkness, if we look at the reform lines, starting from the first reform line, which is Genesis chapter 1. Genesis chapter 1, the period of darkness is the rebellion in heaven and God's character, and God creates the earth in response to that. Right? That's why he creates the earth, because of Satan's rebellion. So that means that reform line is an answer to that. And then we have this reform line comes and it ends with the number 7, which is the Sabbath, which is of course also the Sunday law. And then we have a failed reform line, which I didn't get into last night. But then you have the first generation, and the first generation undoes or challenges the reform line that happened. And then you have a series of 4, progressive destruction of 4, a period of darkness, which in the Genesis story is the period just before the flood. And then again, you have another reform line. And we go right from Genesis all the way to our time with this series of reform lines, progressive destructions of 4, reform lines, progressive destructions of 4. And every time we have a reform line, there is a certain specific darkness that reform line is responding to. So if we look at Thyatira, which is the number 4 in the Millerite reform line, Thyatira, what is the period of darkness there? There's lots there. Persecution of God's people, the rejection of the Bible, and when we look at what happens in the increase of light in Millerite history, we have the increase of light is regarding God's Word and the understanding of God's Word. So, it's a good question, and I do deal with it later on in the book, dealing with reform lines. But if you just think about it, you take some time on your own, and you look at the reform lines that we do have, and you look at the period of darknesses that precede that, you'll see that the reform line responds to it. Another good example is we have the progressive destruction of 4 with Manasseh, Jehoiakim, Jehoiachin, and Zedekiah, which leads to the Babylonian captivity. And then we have a reform line, which is the reform line of Cyrus. So what does Cyrus's reform line address? So the darkness is the captivity. What does his reform line address? Release from the captivity. So the return. So you can see very clearly there that reform line is all addressing the fact that they're in captivity. So, it's something to think about and look at. Now, the next thing that we want to address is the calendars. So we've looked at this a little bit in the story of the flood, but we need to understand it more clearly. And So this is on page 22, the civil and religious calendar. So it says in Exodus 12, verse 2, this month, which referring to Abib or Aviv or Nisan, however, Nisan is the Babylonian name of the month, shall be unto you the beginning, and it has this word Rosh. So this Hebrew word Rosh is important. It means head, and it can mean beginning. Like the first word in the Hebrew Bible is Bereshit, which means in the beginning. Rashit means beginning. It has the root as Rosh. And we also have Rosh Hashanah, which Rosh is the head, Hashanah is the year. Shana is year, Ha is the. So this word Rosh you do run into. Now here it says that Abib is going to be the Rosh, or the head of months. It shall be the first month of the year to you. And the question relating to counting the months, somebody commented on one of the videos of Chronology something about that, you know, we can't start the year in the fall. It has to always start in the spring because that's what the Bible does. But we do know that there are views that the modern Jews definitely count the year from the fall, even though they count it starting at the 7th month. They don't call the Tishri the first month ever. So when you count the months, you always count them from the spring. And the first time that we are given a count of the months is there in Exodus 12, verse 2. So God gives them this count, and we have made the point that this count is for the religious year, and that at this time is the first time that they set up a sort of, not a calculated calendar, but a preset calendar. That is, prior to this time, how would you tell that a month has begun? What was the only way you would know that a month has begun? The moon. But if we were to do that for the religious calendar, what are some of the problems? We pointed out before, on the 29th of the month, you would, at the evening, you would look at the sky, and if you saw a crescent moon, you would know the next day is the 1st. If you didn't, you would know the next day is the 30th. And of course, the only problem is whether there's cloud or dust that might obscure your viewing of it. So if you always had an observed month, you would find that people, and individual people doing this. So in the past, before the Exodus, probably individuals would just kind of look up and say, oh, it's a new month. They wouldn't really think about it. As far as contracts could maybe, you know, if you had a contract and you dated it based on the calendar, I don't know if they did in those days. They probably didn't. But later on they did. So as you got more bureaucracies going in governments, and you had contracts, then it was much more important that you actually date things correctly. But for the religious calendar here, it's important that they know ahead of time when the feasts are going to occur. And so you can't have a disagreement about that. So God set up a pattern where the first month would be 30 days, the second month would be 29, the third month would be 30, the fourth month would be 29, the fifth month would be 30, the sixth month would be 29, and the seventh month, it could be 29 or 30, because by then, at the end of the seventh month, the religious calendar is over. There's no feasts or celebrations in the 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th, or if you need it, the 13th month. So those months, from the end of the seventh month, so the length of the seventh month, and the length of the 8th month, and those, they would be determined by observation of the moon. But to start the year is the only place where those first 6 months are set up, and that's by the observance of the first crescent in the spring. And that's not well known. And I pointed out that Grace Amadon clearly shows this in her ministry articles, and you can look at those in there in the 1940s that she wrote in Ministry Magazine, and you can search her up. So they're easy to find, and she goes through this and explains the calendar really well. And I found this on my own. It took me a long time. So it would have been easier just to read her articles, but I didn't find her articles till later. Yes, Bronwyn. Amadon is Amadon. I'm not good at spelling in my head, but yeah, in Grace. And she wrote in scholarly papers, but was not well received for two reasons. One, she was a woman, and the other was she was a Seventh-day Adventist. And so if you read other scholars, they attack a lot of her views. But her views supported the Millerite understanding of the commencement of the 2300 days. And that's why she did the research to do that. So her research parallels a lot of my research in understanding when the Passover was in 31 AD, and she shows how that works. And she has some ideas that are interesting that I'm not 100% certain if they're correct. One is she says that the Passover never occurs before the full moon, and that the Jews use the anomaly of the moon, which is an astronomical thing that we don't have time to go into, but they would know that when the full moon was going to occur in the first month, and so they may delay the start of the month, not just based upon the observance of the moon, but also knowing when the full moon was going to occur. So she uses an argument slightly different than mine to place, because we know the Passover in 31 AD was on Friday, wasn't on Wednesday. We don't believe in a Wednesday crucifixion. And that it was the 14th of the month. And that this would have occurred in 31 AD on April 27th. So that's something that we have to believe if we're in this message, and we believe Millerite history, and we believe that we're Seventh-day Adventists, and we believe the 2300 days and the 70 weeks. We cannot place the Passover on any other date if we're a Seventh-day Adventist. It has to be April 27th, 31 AD. Yes.
So even so, you're saying that the first 6 months basically was 29, 30.
3029.
30, 29, excuse me, gotta keep it right. If that's the case, then you're saying when it got up to the Passover,
Got the Day of Atonement. When the Day of Atonement was passed.
yeah. But when that happened, so you're saying that they did actually look at and know if it was a full moon, then they delayed something?
No, they would do that before. They could know that before the month began. Based on observing the moon, they would know, because sometimes the months are longer and sometimes they're shorter,
Yeah.
because of the orbit of the moon is elliptical.
Yeah.
And so, it's not symmetrical how the months work and where the full moon lies. So, yeah, they would know this when the month is beginning. They'd already know where the full moon is going to be, whether it's going to be a long stretch to the full moon from when they see the new moon, or whether it's going to be a short distance. They could tell this. They would know it ahead of time. So even though they may see a new moon, this is what she says, even though they may see a new moon, they may not start the month the next day, because they may know that it's a short span, that the full moon's going to be early. This full moon's going to be late. And so then they're going to add an extra day so that the Passover isn't before the full moon. That's her argument. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. There's other ways that we can do it.
So if the first 6 months are locked in with the 30-29
Yeah.
pattern, but you're still saying what before that you get done with this whole 10th day of the 7th month, that there actually is something that they look at the moon to know whether it's adjusted by a day?
No. Only at the beginning of the
Only
year.
at the beginning of the year.
Beginning of the year,
Okay,
they
the
set
beginning
up
of the year.
at the beginning of the year.
so
And they
that's-
don't observe them.
starts it then.
Yeah. Now the Millerites, they looked at the moon starting the 7th month, and they thought that had something to do with the Day of Atonement, setting the Day of Atonement. And because they didn't understand that there was this preset calendar of 30-29 for the first 6 months. So, these are things that people debate about, but I've taken this position and I've been able to demonstrate it through all these different calendars in different histories where we have very specific dates, like in Ezekiel and in Ezra, right? Ezra 7:9, and the chronology there. And we're going to look at that, which is really, really compelling, is what happens in 457 when Ezra leaves Babylon. So those dates that we have are extremely important. Knowing that it's always 187 days from the first day of the first month to the 10th day of the 7th month is extremely important. And so I believe that we can confirm these calendars by understanding this message and by understanding an exact chronology of all the dates that God has given us in the Bible. These things fit in so perfectly, to me, it cannot be wrong. I can't be wrong about the calendar, because if I was wrong about the calendar, then all these things fall apart. They don't mean anything. But if the calendar is correct, all these things confirm that.
So you're saying that from the first day of the first month to the 10th day of the 7th month is always a fixed period of time, but when they started the first day of the first month, sometimes would adjust a
Right.
day, whether it was a full moon or not.
Right, so that the Passover, that's what Grace Amadon says. And I'm not sure if that's true, but what I do know is that we can have a Friday crucifixion in 31 AD, because each of the months, like the 10th, 11th, 12th month, the 13th month, and in 31 AD, when Jesus is crucified, there is a 13th month. That means there is a leap month. There's a second Adar. So he's not crucified in March, he's crucified in April, because the March crucifixion, the month would start before the equinox, and the month never begins, the year never begins before the spring equinox. So the earliest you can have the first day of the first month is April 5th. So you can never have a crucifixion in March, because that would be the 14th day of the first month. It would be too early. So in 31 AD, there's a leap month. And this is kind of laid out in the book, and this is a lot of detail, so I don't know if everybody's really following this. But we have this extra month added in 31 AD. But the months that precede that month could have 29 or 30, depending upon the observance of the moon. So when people look at the NASA's charts in 31 AD, they will find that the conjunction occurs on a Tuesday. So that means that the new moon would be seen on the Wednesday evening, and the first day of the month would be on a Thursday. And so people say you can't possibly have a Friday crucifixion, because Jesus then would be crucified on the Wednesday in 31 AD. Does that make sense? Because if the first day of the first month, because that would be the 15th, so the 14th would be a Wednesday, if we just looked at NASA's charts. What we're not considering is that we can't just look at the new moon, because let's say we had a couple of months before that, the new moon was obscured by cloud. So then when you go out, you only go out on the 29th. So even though there might have been a new moon on the 28th in the month before, nobody's going to go out and look for it, because you cannot have a month that's 28 days. So you have to wait to the evening of the 29th. Then on the 29th, if it's cloudy, even if there was a new moon on the 28th, but you go out on the 29th and it's cloudy, you then know that you still have to have 30 days in that month. So the chances that the Friday crucifixion occurred in 31 AD is only a 6% chance. That is, most likely, if the astronomical conditions were good, we would have had a Wednesday crucifixion in 31 AD. But because of the cloud, because of the way it's observed, the chances is only 6%. But we don't need more than 6%, because 6% just means that it's possible. And we know based upon other things that it was a Friday crucifixion. Yeah. So that means it was one of those rare occasions where the Passover or the beginning of the month is delayed a couple of days. And that's all. And so anybody who tries to tell you, and this you'll see on anti-Adventist websites where they're attacking our understanding of a Friday crucifixion in 31 AD, saying it's impossible, is because they're not considering how the month is observed and how the beginning of the year is observed. They're just looking at charts and they're saying, well, there's a new moon there, so it has to have occurred. The first day of the first month must have been on the Thursday, but it wasn't. The first day of the first month was on a Saturday. or Sabbath, in 31 AD. And we know that because of other testimonies. Okay, so I hope that's clear. I mean, it would actually be harder to draw this all out. It's easier to discuss it. Now, you'll see on page 22 at the bottom, I show this calendar of the religious year and the civil year. So you have, if you look at this here, now this is a leap month. So normally this is the first day of the first month. And that means that the spring equinox has to have occurred prior to this date. So if the spring equinox was here, that spring equinox, you couldn't have this as the first day of the first month. So they would then add this extra month, and this happens every second or third year, and in a 19-year Metonic cycle, it happens 7 times. So, and it's a very, very accurate calendar. It's actually more accurate than our Gregorian calendar. To start again the cycle, it's very, very precise with the sky. Ours, we add a leap year, and in a leap year, we add an extra day every 4 years, except when they're marking a century, except at a millennium, we do add them. So ours shifts around a little bit compared to this calendar. This calendar, every 19th year, it's very precise where it starts again. It starts exactly at the same point. Much more exact than our calendar does when it starts again. And we know that this is the religious year, so the religious year has 7 months. But the 7th month is the first month of the civil year, but it's still called the 7th month. And you would count certain things from this. One would be the reigns of the kings of Israel. They counted from the beginning of the 7th month. And during the time of the Persian kings, the Jews sometimes counted the reigns of the Persian kings starting at the 7th month. So Artaxerxes, in Ezra chapter 7, when it says it's the 7th year of the reign of Artaxerxes, they're counting it from the 7th month. But Artaxerxes counts it from the first month himself, because the Persians always counted from the first month. And we'll find also that northern Israel, and we'll study this a little bit later, but northern Israel always counted the reigns of the kings from the spring until either the time of Manasseh, Ammon, or Josiah. Somewhere in there they changed after the fall of northern Israel, which counted the reigns of their kings fall to fall. The kings of Judah then adopted the fall to fall counting of the reigns, and we can prove that in the reign of Josiah. So we know by Josiah at least they were counting fall to fall. And my guess is that Manasseh, because of his rebellion after Samaria fell, he chose to adopt the fall to fall count. And then the last king of Judah, who's set up by Nebuchadnezzar, which is Zedekiah, he once again is a spring to spring reign. And so that's confusing, and biblical scholars have had a hard time piecing together some of this chronology of Ezekiel and Jeremiah, because they make assumptions that it's either always spring to spring or always fall to fall, and they get them switched around. So, it's something, it's a important detail, and we are going to look at it. But just to think about it now, that it's something that we are going to have to understand if we're going to understand the chronology of the Millerite history. To sort of prove 457 BC, we need to understand the civil calendar. And the Millerites did understand the religious and the civil calendar. Now, the next question that we're going to deal with is the Passover. So one of the things that we're dealing with in this message has to do with the Passover in the time of Christ. And of course, we need to look to the first Passover to understand this. So when is the Passover lamb slain? Any ideas? Okay, it's the 14th day. It's the evening of the 14th. Let's look at some Bible verses here. So we're going to look at Exodus chapter 12 and a couple of other places. But Exodus chapter 12, verse 6, I believe. Let's go backwards instead of always starting with Alyssa. Bronwyn, do you want to read verse 1 to 6?
12, 1 to 6. And the Lord spake unto Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, saying, This month shall be unto you the beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year to you. Speak ye unto all the congregation of Israel, saying, In the 10th day of this month shall they take to them every man a lamb, according to the house of their fathers, a lamb for an house. And if the household be too little for the lamb, let him and his neighbor next unto his house take it according to the number of the souls. Every man according to his eating shall make your count for the lamb. Your lamb shall be without blemish, a male of the first year. Ye shall take it out from the sheep or from the goats. And ye shall keep it up until the 14th day of the same month. And the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill it in the evening.
Okay, so we have the first day of the first month. That begins the year. And then we're going to have all these days. So on the 10th day of the month, they have to take a lamb of the sheep or the goats, and they have to bring it into their home, and they're going to keep it until the 14th day. So here we have a lamb that is chosen, and then here we're going to have a lamb that is slain. Now, what is the evening of the 14th? Is it here or is it here? Or is it somewhere else? Okay, so how do you know it's between 13 and 14?
Evenings. That word in Hebrew is actually between evenings. And if you do a little research about a lamb, preparing a lamb, it was supposed to be cooked completely without removing any of the intestinal things. And I did a little research on that. How long does it take? The Greek says that if you remove the intestinals and you just cook it slowly over fire, it takes at least 4 to 5 hours. But if it's completely full, it takes even longer than that.
Okay. So we have, when you do research on this topic, you will find a myriad of opinions on the internet. And you're going to find all kinds of things that are completely contradictory. And I've flipped around with this for 35 years. I've probably held every single one of those opinions for a length of time. So it's a difficult question, and I think that this message helps answer this question.
Amen.
And of course, the spirit of prophecy helps us quite a bit as well. And when I say that there are different opinions, there's different opinions. Some people believe the Passover is slain on the evening of the 14th, at the end of the 14th, and that the Passover is eaten on the 15th. Some people believe the Passover's lamb is slain 3 o'clock in the afternoon on the 14th. There's a much more minority position, which I hold, is the Passover's lamb slain on the beginning of the 14th, or even on the 13th. Possibly, because in how they're looking at this, there's this Hebrew expression that where all the debate lies. Because when it says it's slain at even, this word in Hebrew is bayin ha'abayim. I believe is how it's pronounced. It just means between the two evenings. Now, what does that mean? Well, you will find a whole bunch of different opinions and a whole bunch of different proofs and biblical arguments that people use. They'll use the same scriptures and come up with completely different and contradictory views. Yes, Richard?
And that word evening in verse 6 means in between the two evenings?
No, in the word in.
Oh, the word in, okay.
In verse 6, the word even is the expression, it's actually an expression. It's not just even, it's ha-arba'im. That means the evenings, and the word before it is between. So when it says at even, kill it in the evening, yes. That word in means between, yes. Well, okay, is evening sunset? Well, now this is 2 evenings, and the lamb is slain between 2 evenings. So when is the first evening? Right? So you'll have different, some say it's noon. And some say the second evening is sunset. I take the position that between the 2 evenings is what we would call twilight, which is between the lights. So the lights of the day and the lights of the night. So there's this period of dusk from when the sun sets to when we now can see the stars. That would be twilight. And my view is that between the 2 evenings at least represents this. It could even be a bit of a broader term that refers to a larger period of time. But it doesn't refer to what we would normally call even, which is sunset. So we know that it's different than the other places that we just see the word even. Now, another place that we see this is in Numbers. So let's go there. Numbers chapter 9. So it just says basically the same thing in verse 3. In the 14th day of the month, at even, ye shall keep it in its appointed season. So this is telling us to keep the Passover, and it's just telling us this is actually in the 2nd year after they were come out of Egypt, according to verse 1. So he's telling them they're going to keep it. So the first time is telling them what they were going to do at the actual Exodus Passover. This is a year later. Now you're going to keep this as a memorial. And this is also in Leviticus 23. So we don't need to look there. So there's something about this expression, and I'm not going to go into, because we could spend a lot of time, but there's other things we want to look at. But we've taken the position that the Passover that Jesus had with his disciples was the Passover. And one opinion I held for a long time was that there was 2 different Passovers being kept. There was the Passovers that the disciples were keeping with Christ, which was the biblical Passover, and that the Jews were keeping another Passover. And that's based upon this argument that the priests and the scribes and all those people, when they're the Sanhedrin, when they were going through this process of bringing Jesus to all these different trials, that they didn't want to enter into Pilate's judgment hall because they didn't want to become unclean. And so the suggestion is, well, they haven't eaten the Passover yet. But my understanding is that they're actually referring to the feast of the Passover that's going to start on the next day. So the Passover lamb, either they had already eaten it and had their Passover meal, or if they hadn't eaten it, which they're supposed to do before morning, if they hadn't eaten it, they were just more concerned with being defiled than they were about the fact that they had transgressed the law of the Passover already. And it seems to me that the rabbis and all these people were much more concerned about ceremonial uncleanness than almost anything else. So they could have a trial at night, which is against the law. So obviously they could delay eating the Passover till after sunrise. So, but one of the big arguments people use is that obviously in their mind, the Jews hadn't had the Passover yet, so the Passover lamb would be slain on the Friday afternoon. Now, I believed, and I think almost every Adventist I've ever talked to believes that Jesus was crucified at the time of the Passover lamb. But if you read the Spirit of Prophecy, and I probably should have the statement here, and maybe somebody can find it for us, but Ellen White says that Jesus was crucified at the time of the evening sacrifice. Now, he is our Passover, that is, all the sacrifices point forward to Christ, but he didn't die at the time of all the different sacrifices. but he did die at the time of the Passover season. So the fact that he is crucified at the time of the evening sacrifice, and it's the evening sacrifice that escapes the hands of the priest as he's about to slay it, not the Passover lamb. The Passover lamb would have been slain the evening before. Yes, Tanya, you have a comment?
It's interesting that the Jewish were not called to present themselves to the Lord at the time of the Passover. There were three feasts that they were supposed to come to Jerusalem, and the Passover was not one of them. Only the feast of the yeah.
Okay, so how does this apply to what we're talking about then?
We were discussing this in our prayer meeting about when was the Passover lamb eaten. Jesus, Sister White points out that Jesus actually represents more than just the lamb that was slain for the Passover.
Mhm.
It was also the red heifer.
All the
So,
sacrifices.
yeah, so he becomes a symbol.
Mhm. Yeah, and he has the Passover with his disciples, so they've eaten the Passover lamb. Yes, Luke.
Quote if you want it.
Okay.
Desire of Ages 756.5. When the loud cry, "It is finished," came from the lips of Christ, the priests were officiating in the temple. It was the hour of the evening sacrifice. The lamb representing Christ had been brought to be slain.
Yeah, and she says other places too that specifically that it's that. But until recently, I always thought it was the Passover lamb that escaped. So some of those ideas, that we have, they seem logical, and we just kind of don't look at the details. But it's very clear, I think, from the Bible and the Spirit of prophecy that Jesus ate the actual Passover meal with his disciples. Yes,
So
Richard.
just help me understand. So all the Jews, they were there that particular weekend for the feast and not necessarily the Passover?
No, they're there for the Passover. It's just they were concerned about being defiled, not for the eating of the Passover lamb itself, but just for the rest of the feast. Because if they had gone into Pilate's judgment hall, they couldn't have the feast the next day. They're having a feast for 8 days, if you count the Passover.
Right now, I think because unless I misunderstood, I thought that you said they were maybe Sister Tanya, that the Passover was not one of the required feasts that everyone attends. I thought that's what we said.
Yes.
So they were there.
Feast of unleavened bread.
That's why they were there.
Yes.
Feast of unleavened bread, and not necessarily the Passover.
They were supposed to keep the Passover with other families because when you slay a lamb, you had to have a certain amount of people to make sure that all the lamb was eaten. And so wherever they were coming and they had friends or family or whatever, they all united, they did that. But that was not the requirement for them to be at Jerusalem. There's only 3 feasts that they were required for them to come to Jerusalem to meet with the Lord.
Yeah.
And you can find that in Leviticus.
Yes.
Leviticus 23. The Lord is specific. These are the feasts that all the male are required to gather. Unleavened bread, Pentecost, and
The Feast of the
Tabernacles. Those 3. But as you will see in the Gospels, Luke says that it was the Feast of Passover, also called unleavened bread. So they combined them.
Yep.
But in actuality, they were not required to gather for Passover. Theodore made a point which I didn't think about, not in here. They were never to kill the Passover at the sanctuary. They were supposed to kill it within their dwellings, not as a public gathering. So those things need to be taken into consideration
Now,
as well.
commercialization of the Passover had occurred by the time of Christ. So one of the things that people were doing is they weren't home, they were in Jerusalem for the Passover. And so if you were coming into Jerusalem, obviously you're not going to bring all your lambs. And so they were buying Passover lambs at the temple, and the idea is that these might be slain at the temple. But there's still disputes about some of these things. But we would know that Jesus and his disciples, they prepared the Passover correctly. And so, some arguments are that, this Friday afternoon, slaughter of Passover lambs was occurring. I'm not certain, how to resolve that, whether it was the day before or not, or whether there, in a sense, was 2 Passovers sort of kept. That's a possibility. But we know what the biblical Passover is. Now, when we're dealing with the Exodus itself, yeah.
When you read Samuel Snow's work, one of the thought that he puts forward is the crucifixion and how it is that he fulfilled the types in all sense of the word, even as the Passover lamb. So even as we study the midnight cry in the evenings, one of the arguments of Samuel Snow is that the death of Christ is a typification of the slaying of the Passover lamb.
Yeah. Well, it is. But it doesn't mean he has to be slain at the same time as the Passover.
The pioneers do hold that view because when you search in it, and if you're going through the pioneers' writing, you do see them saying that Christ died at the time, the specific time that the Passover would be killed. But Ellen White says on the 14th day of the first month, the Christ instituted the feast of communion, the communion service. She doesn't use that word, but she's very specific. She says at the very, at that time. And she also says that they were in Desire of Ages, chapter 70. She says it was a transition period where the Jewish economy was forever to be swept away, and Christ was now instituting something new.
Yes.
So therefore, if he's sweeping away the old and instituting something new, the time that he's doing it has to be at the very time that those things would be happening. So he's at a turning point, and that was when he was keeping the Passover with his disciples.
And that's why when later that day, when they're offering the evening sacrifice, and Jesus is being crucified on the cross, that evening sacrifice escapes from the hand of the priest. And of course, we know the veil of the temple was ripped in two. Yes, you.
One of the works that was quoted was from Joseph Samuel C.F. Frey. And each time you look up between the two evenings, his work is what is referenced. And he's a Jew that wrote a series of papers on the Passover in 1837. And one of the things that he shared is that there are a series of ceremonies that has to be observed before the Passover is literally kept. And one of the ideas he put forward is that to observe the Feast of Unleavened Bread, you have to start at the evening of the 13th day / 14th day. So 13th / 14th. And what actually happens is that there are a series of things that are done to get the leaven, which is sin, out of the life. And in my mind, it lines up perfectly with Judas leaving the table at night, who is a representation of the leaven among the disciples. And the idea that is understood by the pioneers is that the Lord's Supper is separate and distinct from the Passover meal.
Yeah, I know that's the view, but I don't think that's correct. And yeah, so one of the things dealing with the Jews and the rabbis is they can be useful, but they're not inspired. And some people make a great deal about what the rabbis teach or what the Jews teach. But there's many things that they teach that are contrary to the Scriptures. Even how they do their calendar is contrary to the Scriptures. And so we can look at these things, but I think when we look at the Exodus story itself, which we're going to do here in Exodus chapter 12, and of course we could use a lot more time for this, but we have, God tells them to set apart this lamb, and then they're going to slay it on the evening of the 14th. Now we would think of the evening of the 14th at the end of the evening, but the evening of the 14th is the beginning, right? Because the day starts in the evening. It doesn't end in the evening, if that makes sense. It's starting in the evening. Yes?
There's a depiction that really helped me draw when you draw the days and then this dark spot, the 2 evenings, and it helps me to visualize it in my mind when I seen that up on a board this last week when
Yes.
we discussed this.
Splitting the days into not just days like this, but
On its own separate little graph, it makes it.
yeah. So when the evening is always the beginning. Now, when we have, and I'm kind of jumping ahead a little bit, but Jesus, when is he chosen as the Passover lamb?
The triumphal entry on the 10th
Okay.
day.
The triumphal entry happens on the 9th day. So, but when does it happen on the 9th day? Just before, well, it's not the 10th day, because the triumphal entry is not on the 10th day, it's on the 9th.
But it happens in the evening of the
Just
9th
let me
day.
finish this here. So we know that according to Desire of Ages, that he comes at the westering sun. The sun is setting, it's shining off the white marble of the temple. And what does he do after he weeps over Jerusalem? What does she say that he does next? We don't have the statement. We could read it, but these take time. So what happens next? Anybody know?
Pronounces the judgment.
He goes into the temple. And when he gets into the temple, it's going to be the 10th. So he enters into the temple on the 10th, after sunset. So that's when the Passover lamb is chosen. Now the next day, he cleanses the temple, and the children are, Ellen White says, they're shouting the hosannas or echoing the hosannas from the day before.
Amen.
And so here he's in the temple and he cleanses it. We can't mark the 9th as, this is the triumphal entry. The triumphal entry is not the 10th because we know the Friday is the 14th. Does that make sense? So there's no way that this can be the 10th of the month. But when he enters the temple, it's the 10th, and the next day he's there to cleanse it. And there's a whole bunch dealing with this Passover week that we're not going to deal with. But then it's,
We're dealing a matter of maybe a few minutes, because he's there at dusk, he's there when everything is going down. And then so he's basically at the end of the 9th entering the 10th.
yeah, but the triumphal entry itself is technically on the 9th. Because if we say the triumphal entry is on the 10th, then the Friday is the 15th, right? So, because this is happening during the day, it's not sunset when they're, and this is taking some time. This is his entry into Jerusalem. When he gets into Jerusalem and he gets to the temple and he weeps over it, it's just before sunset. And then when he enters the temple, it would be at sunset or just after sunset.
Why do you say that? Why do you say that it has to be, if it's on the 10th, then it would be on the 15th?
Because if this is Sunday, this is Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Sabbath. So you can't have this be the 10th and this be the 14th. This has to be the 9th. It's just math. Yep.
And it says, super clear in Desire of Ages, it was on the first day of the week that Christ made his triumphal entry into Jerusalem. So
Yes.
So right away you can place it and move forward, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. But people get stuck over this because many people think the triumphal entry is on the 10th day of the month, but they just don't bother counting. They know it's on Sunday, they know it's on but they think it's the 10th because actually many people teach that Jesus was crucified on the 15th. Believe it or not. So, so this is an important point. Now, when we deal with the Exodus itself, and we don't have a lot of time, we got about a half an hour to do something that should take a week. But we know that the month the year has begun on the first day of the first month in Exodus 12, verse 2. And so we have, flip over to page 25 and 26. And you're going to have to flip back to page 24 because we have a calendar there as well. But here on page 26, I have written the events with the Bible verses, and there's probably typos in there, I think, that I didn't correct, that I remembered that I was going to correct and I didn't. But anyway, so some of the verse references may be incorrect. I'm not sure if I corrected them. But we have, in verse 3, it says, on Exodus 12, so we have the verses there. The first day, the first month, 10th day. And we can see I have it placed as Sabbath, April 21st, 1533 BC. So in the time of the Exodus, this is a Sabbath. And there's lots of ways that we can confirm these dates and the days of the week. But I'm not going to be able to go through that. But when I went through this calendar, if you flip back to page 24, here we have the calendar. This is the calendar marking when the first day of the first month was in 53 BC. On the Julian calendar, it's April 12th. That's the first day of the first month. So we can see that the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, that's the day that they left, is on the 15th. That's the day they left Ramses with a high hand. And the 14th is when the Passover lamb was slain. And the issue here is, was the Passover lamb slain at the end of the 14th or at the beginning? So let's try to illustrate this and get an understanding of this. So we're going to do this here. So here we have a day. So this is the night. And this is the daytime. And this is going to be the 14th. And then we're going to do the same with the 15th. So this is the 15th. So here you're going to have the day beginning, right? This is going to be sunset. You got your sunsets that start the day, because evening and morning is a day. And many people believe that the Passover lamb is slain here, and then at midnight, the death angel passes over, and the firstborn are killed in all the land of Egypt, but not in the houses of Israel, where they put the blood of the lamb on the doorposts and the lintel. And they have to stay here until morning. Right? And then they have to leave. And then what they'll have is they have them leave Egypt here on the 15th. Now it is true, according to Numbers, I can't remember the verse, if somebody wants to look it up, but they leave Egypt with a high hand and they leave Ramses. Now where are the children of Israel when they're in Egypt during this time? Goshen. Now Goshen is an area, a territory, it's not a city. Ramses is a city. So here's my understanding, instead of sort of, we can maybe discuss it. Because this is where I place the death angel, right? So this is the Passover, the passing over of the death angel, and the lamb is slain here. So they would slay this lamb between the two evenings, they would roast it, and they would eat it in the nighttime, and then this death angel would have passed over, and they're supposed to stay in their houses until morning.
Actually, they're supposed to eat it at the same time that the death angel was passing over. There's a
Right,
specific...
so they're eating it here at the time of midnight, right? So when it says they're eating it in the night, this is in midnight. So it takes time to cook it, as Tanya put out, says. So, they didn't slay it and eat it right here. Now, when the disciples sat down to eat the Passover meal with Christ, well, it says they sat down, but it doesn't mean they ate it there right away.
Wasn't everything furnished for them? They
That
didn't
was
really have to
furnished,
do
they sit
anything?
down, so they're sitting down for a meal. Sitting down for a meal in that culture is a lot more than just eating. Yeah,
The servant of the Lord is very clear.
okay.
It was the disciples that made the preparation. She said that Judas pretended as if but he had gone to betray Christ. So he did not partake in that preparation.
Yeah.
Another point she makes is that they could not eat the Passover with the condition that their hearts were in. So even though they sat down, they did not eat. The foot washing
Okay.
had to take place first.
Yes, we know that. So,
So I'm making the point that even though they said that they went there at evening, they did not begin eating as you're saying.
Yeah.
Actually, we went through that and we recognized that actually they eat the lamb first, then the Lord washes their feet, and then they partake of the bread and the wine. There's a specific, we actually went through that.
Do you have a quote?
Yeah, we did, we've actually went through that.
No, I'm asking for it, please.
Yeah, okay.
Evidence.
Okay, well, we'll deal with that point later. Right now, I want to look at the Exodus itself. So, if they were going to do all this on the 15th, technically, one thing they have to do is they have to spoil the Egyptians, right? Another thing is, Pharaoh's son dies, he has to go to Moses or call Moses to come to him. Then Moses has to go back and tell the people that they can leave. And we know that when they leave on the 15th, the daytime of the 15th, in the morning of the 15th, that they leave with a high hand and they go out harnessed. That word harnessed means that they're going out organized like a military. So there is a period of time in which they have to gather at Ramses to leave. So to place everything in that on the 15th is really what people are doing when they say that the Passover lamb is slain on the evening of the 14th. They're placing all those events of that night. You have 2 million people plus their cattle that are somehow going to do all of this, even though they're still inside their homes. It's not possible. So the logistics of it demand that the Passover lamb has to be slain from the time that we go from the 13th to the 14th, that the Passover itself is on the 14th, but they leave on the morning of the 15th. So this is a very minority position because the Jews don't have this position, and so the Jews tend to dominate the Passover discussion because it's kind of theirs, at least, in most people's minds. So I take this position that there's just the logistics of it, that it demands that the Passover lamb be slain at the beginning of the 14th, not the end of the 14th, for this all to fit in. And this fits in with the time of Christ. So here we have the Passover lamb. The Passover lamb is being chosen at the evening as we're going from the 9th to the 10th. Christ is coming into the temple. And then he's going to, it says, keep it until the 14th. So at the 14th, the Passover lamb is slain. And Jesus then is having the Passover meal with his disciples. So this is, the Last Supper is happening this night here. And then when Jesus is finally crucified and dies, this is the cross here. It's going to be at the time of the evening sacrifice. And then the 15th, this is the day that they leave Egypt. This is the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which is sometimes, this is called the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, or the first day of the feast, because the feast is 7 days. This is the 8th. Anyway, you understand what I'm saying? So in the Exodus, we have this, all these logistics are important in understanding the event. Pharaoh just can't, do a cell phone call or a text message to Moses to tell them that you can now go. It's going to take time. It's going to take a number of hours for this to occur. Yes, Bronwyn?
It also gives you some light on sunset, because if you go with this model that you've set up, you show a lamb being killed at sunset, your loins are girt, your shoes are on, your staff's in hand. You've got a whole lot of things happening right at sunset that I think it's well placed at sunset on this model that you've laid out.
Yeah, and we know that Satan has tried to obscure these truths and bury them. And the Jews are part of that apostasy. So there are some people that are very, very dependent upon Jewish understanding of things. And the Jews are not always correct. But it's hard, to take a position like this. The whole scholarly world pretty much takes this position. But there are many people who agree with us. So, and their arguments are very sound biblically from what I can see. It's just the main arguments, and the thing, you can always tell a little bit who's correct, not always, but often, by the spirit in which things are done. That is, this view that we just presented here, when it is addressed by people who are opposed to it, is usually addressed in mocking and they don't actually represent the argument correctly. But generally, when you see this view presented, we don't see the mocking the other way, and we do see the proper presentation of the other arguments. So it's not always a way to tell whether something's true, but when people have a weak argument, they usually resort to mocking because they don't have an argument. So, okay, Tanya.
Just want to bring one point. Before this whole thing happened, Sister I points out that they already had organized. Each household was told where they were supposed to meet and how they were going to move forward. So like you said, on the 15th they leave, but they have a point of meeting where they were supposed to get organized, and then finally on the 15th they leave all together as a group, as a whole.
Yeah, so Ramsey is the muster point where they meet to leave Egypt. Yes, Richard?
What point on the 15th did they actually physically leave?
In the morning.
In the morning?
Before sunrise. So I'm glad, this is going over well in this class. But, if I was having a whole bunch of biblical scholars here, it wouldn't work out too well. Now, we're going to look at some things that, these things are not adamant. But in trying to lay out the chronology of them leaving and where they would travel, I had to look at how fast could they travel, how much distance did they need to travel, and I looked at in Numbers where they lay out all the different stopping points, and so we're going to address this. We have like 15 minutes to do it, and I know there's going to be differences. So if you go on the internet and you look at the Exodus and where Mount Sinai is and where they crossed the Red Sea, 99% of what you will see is Ron Wyatt. Now, it's not necessarily Ron Wyatt's own writings, but it's people who have believed his view, which is a really modern view. Ron Wyatt came up with it in the 80s. But that's the predominant view, massively predominant. If you're going to look at the traditional view, even then there's a few different traditional views, it's really in the minority, represented on the internet. And that's because Ron Wyatt was a person who was willing to deceive people to make money, and his evidence is, most of it's fake, and most of it's completely irrelevant. So an example is he chooses Jebel Alaz as Mount Sinai, and one of his arguments is that it's blackened on the top. If you look at the mountains in the Sinai Peninsula and all that area, I shouldn't say the vast majority. The majority of them are black on the top. That's because that's the rock that is in that layer, and so everywhere you look, the mountaintops are all blackened. So it's not really an argument. And then, crossing the Gulf of Aqaba, he tries to give this evidence that here's this place where they could have crossed. And, if you look at the pass that the people have to go through, it would take 8 days for the people, just 2 million people, at a very quick pace, much faster than they could have walked with the animals and the children and everything, to go through this pass to get onto the beach that supposedly they used to cross the Gulf of Aqaba. And more likely it would have taken 3 weeks for them to get through that pass. So wherever they traveled, they needed to travel. 2 million people is a large amount of people. Where they crossed, I have here on page 25, this is the Gulf of Suez. And at the top part of the Gulf of Suez, there is a place where they could cross 1,000 abreast easily in very shallow water. And I'm going to draw it here. So, and I don't have time to look at all the Bible verses, but I just want to point this out because there's some interesting things that come from this. So here you have the Gulf of Suez, and you got this narrower part up here. There's mountains along here. And it says that they come to the edge of the wilderness of Etham, which is the wilderness of Shur. It's the same thing. And that they backtrack, and then they get trapped here between the mountains and the armies of Pharaoh. And that they then have to cross all night, and they're back in the wilderness of Etham. So if we're going to deal with, this is the Gulf of Aqaba. It doesn't look anything like that. But if we're going to have the Gulf of Aqaba, it's a much longer distance to cross, and they would have crossed here, and I have no way to explain how they could be on the borders of the wilderness of Etham, cross, and then be in Etham. Here, if at the top of the Suez Gulf, that is possible. But if you're crossing way over here in the middle of the Gulf of Aqaba, it's not possible to be on the borders of the wilderness of Etham, cross, and then be in the wilderness of Etham. I don't know if you follow that argument. But it's just the logistics. So when you look at what the Bible says, and again, you know, when we study, we have to look at all the evidence, and we have to, it all has to make sense. It all has to fit. And if there's loose threads, you know, you pull at them and see if they unravel.
Is
And
that part considered Arabia?
okay, so the question is this part of Arabia? Mount Sinai is in Arabia. This is part, the Sinai Peninsula is part of Arabia in biblical times. In Paul's day, when he talks about Mount Sinai, that's in Arabia, Mount Sinai is in Arabia. So Mount Sinai is here, down here somewhere. Mount Sinai is not over here. And so what he has is in 2 weeks' time, he has them crossing the Red Sea, and then he has them using 5 weeks to get a distance that they could do in a couple of days. You know, that's Ron Wyatt's theory. And there's just tons and tons of holes in his theory, misuse of Bible verses, things that contradict spirit of prophecy. And so, you know, and I used to be a follower of Ron Wyatt, you know, 25 years ago, and until I continued to look at what he was presenting. But most people believe Ron Wyatt's idea about Mount Jebel Lawz. So, an interesting thing, as I went through this, so I've laid this out, and you know, there could be things wrong about it, but one of the interesting points is I've chosen 553 BC for the year of the Exodus. And you will see that I have this map of a solar eclipse that occurred on May 9th, 1533 BC, and it shows universal time, so it's a couple hours off from the time, the local time. But you will see that the couple hours off, if you just think of 1600 hours as being 6 o'clock, you can see that this maximum eclipse occurs at 1603. Now the sun sets at about 1625, so it's actually 6:25 the sun sets at this point where I have the Israelites crossing. This is a total solar eclipse that spans much of Egypt, and this solar eclipse occurs at the time that I had worked out for when the Israelites would have crossed the Red Sea. So that is, on May 9th, I had them crossing the Red Sea that night, so it would be the next day, so they crossed the next night. But just before sunset, there's this solar eclipse. Now, the Bible doesn't mention it. It does mention, however, that when the Israelites are trapped there, that it's dark in the camp of the Egyptians, but there's light in the camp of the Israelites. And there's a number of things. The Pharaoh is Sennacherib Ptah at that time. He had his son mysteriously die 2 weeks before he died. His mummy was partially decomposed when it was mummified. He also had Apophis, who had been gone for 40 years, came to him and warned him of some event that was going to come. So Apophis would be, and it means like good looking, which is what Pharaoh's daughter said about Moses. So that would have been his Egyptian name, would have been Apophis. And so Moses came to Sennacherib Ptah. That's what's being, and this is in the Egyptian writings of the history of this time. So we have the 40 years that Apophis was gone and comes back. We have the 2 weeks that his son dies, and it's the end of the 17th dynasty or dynasty. And the reason why, the Pharaoh is the sun god, and an eclipse of the sun to the people would have marked the end of that dynasty. His brother ruled for 2 years before the next dynasty started. So there's lots of compelling evidence that shows that this is what occurred. Whether I'm correct that it actually happened, that the Exodus, the Red Sea crossing occurred on that day, that's just me working out the travel times, the distance that they would have to get to Mount Sinai. And so I placed it there, and then I saw the eclipse afterwards that it was, and we know that that night the wind blew and they crossed the Red Sea that night, and in the morning watch, the Egyptians then saw them. So during that time, the Egyptians couldn't see what was happening. But God then withdrew the cloud and allowed them to see, and then they went into the Red Sea, and then the waters of the Red Sea closed over them. And then Sennacherib Ptah's body would have been found at some point, brought back to Egypt, and then mummified in its partially decomposed state. So that's a theory, right? Can't prove it, but it is very compelling. Yes, Tyler?
On the map, the total solar eclipse map, dialogue box there, it says 1532, but you're saying 1533?
That's because it's using the astronomical calendar, which they're putting a 0 year in there.
Okay.
So it's, minus 1532, which is 1533. And it's a bit confusing too, because sometimes you'll see people call this May the 10th. And I'm still not sure why, because if you look at it, it's May the 9th. But it has to do with where they're starting to count the day and when the eclipse starts and so forth. So it's a little bit confusing on how they count these things, but they're not counting it from, when they say it's May the 10th, they're not actually counting it locally. But if we count it locally, it's May the 9th at 6:03 p.m., which is about 25 minutes before sunset, that we get the total eclipse. And this total eclipse, you can see that line that's going through there, the center of the total eclipse is only, maybe 25 miles south of where we think they actually crossed. And, it's about a 120-mile swath where they see the total solar eclipse. Yes.
Where did you see 603? I don't get it.
It says 1603. That's 1600 hours.
I thought that's
That's
4
4.
o'clock.
That's 4 o'clock.
Yes, but it's universal time, and it's 2 hours off from there. They're 2 hours difference. So if you look at the local time, it's 6:03. I know it's confusing, but if you look at there, it says that it's in universal time. That's how they always show in astronomical things. They always show everything universal time, not local time. It's not like airports where they use local time.
Military time, or
Well, it's military time, but universal time is in Greenwich Mean Time, we often think of it. So it's just, they're referencing one place on the earth for when they're giving the time. They're not referencing the local place. So locally, they're 2 hours ahead of Greenwich time. And so instead of being 4:03, which it is in Greenwich, England, it's on where they are, it's 6:03. Yes.
I don't know if it's Ellen White or some other commentator that mentions that the plagues on Egypt were a direct attack on the gods of Egypt, and that's when we had the day of darkness, that's one of the plagues, being an attack against the sun god. Did you factor that into?
Yeah, that's correct, and I'm not sure. I've seen that a number of different places. But when we look at it, then obviously the plague of darkness would be an attack upon the sun god, but also if we had an eclipse 2 weeks later, that would be an attack upon the sun god, which is an attack upon Pharaoh, because he is Ra, he is the sun god, yes.
The spirit of prophecy said they could not move for 3 days.
Yeah, when they get here.
No.
What are you talking about?
Darkness.
Oh, the Egyptians could.
3 days.
Okay.
So I'm saying that the eclipse for a day would not account for. She said they had to lay in their place. The 9th plague, she said it was
but that's 2 weeks before.
I know, it's in response. Nathan was drawing that with the eclipse.
No, we weren't. No, he was just, this is 2 weeks later. He was just saying that the darkness that happened at the Passover is similar to what happened at the eclipse in the sense they're both attacks upon the sun god.
Yeah.
Right? That's what you're saying. They're not at the same time. They're 2 weeks apart. So there's lots of different things that happen. If you look on page 27, there's the story of the two different Passovers that happen. And the first and second Passover are important points that we're going to address when we deal with Samuel Snow's letters at the end of all this. Because there is, in Samuel Snow's letters, there's two Passovers. In Millerite history, there's two Passovers. And we've already addressed this in this message, so we don't need to look at it. But I have on the next page just the calendar of when those two Passovers were in the second year. So the year after they left is when they instituted the two different Passovers. So the second Passover is for those who were unclean and unable to keep the first Passover. And so to me, there's some really symbolic significance, which is kind of redundant, but there's significance in these symbols that we will look at. And I think that we can see some more things about this as we go through later. So it's a really incomplete way of looking at the Exodus, really incomplete way of looking at the Passover. Probably there'll be lots of comments on the YouTube video about all the things I did wrong. But we need to study these things out. And if there is something that needs to be corrected, we need to correct it. And so the best way for that to happen is, instead of me just studying by myself, is all of us studying together. And so I think this is a really important starting point, at least to look at some of these things, even though, I mean, we've already been studying them, but to try to pull them all together. And that's what I've been trying to do, is pull all these different truths together and to see this big picture, you know, the puzzle that I'm talking about. We have all these pieces that have been placed in this message in various different ways and very different times, and under God's providence, sometimes just for, and a good example of this, just dealing with the first day of the first month and the 10th day of the 7th month being 187 days. You know, when we looked at the story of Esther and we found this feast for 180 days, and then it's followed by a feast for 7 days. That feast is the Akitu festival that begins on the first day of the first month, and it ends on the 10th day of the 7th month. Well, on the 10th day of the 7th month is when Vashti is called to come in to display her body to all these, you know, princes and kings and rulers and so forth. And if you look at it, it's on the Day of Atonement. It's on the 10th day of the 7th month, and it's a Sabbath as well. And the Jews recognize this. So I found, not that I always accept what the Jews teach, but the Jewish rabbis recognized that when Vashti was called in was the Day of Atonement, and that it was a Sabbath. And so, you know, I'd studied this on my own, came to this conclusion, then found that I wasn't the only one who understood this. But so in the story of Esther, in Xerxes planning his attack against Greece, we have the first day of the first month and the 10th day of the 7th month marked, and we have that in Ezekiel as well. So these are extremely compelling arguments when we put all these truths together, and that we can know that the calendar is correct. So let us close in prayer, and I'll offer prayer. Dear Father in heaven, we are again so thankful that we can be here in this place and enjoy the fellowship and the work and the study time and the discussion time. We're thankful for each person, all the particular talents and abilities, and also all of our particular struggles and things that we are trying to overcome, that you've brought us together to refine us, to purify us. And we know, Lord, that you want to prepare a people and a message, and that you are uniting this message and you're uniting this people to give a message to the Levites. And we just ask, Lord, that you can do this work in us, that you can have us each individually seek you to do this work in us, that we can't depend upon another person to do this work for us. And we know, Lord, that there's many things we still need to understand and many things we're not seeing. And so we just ask that you can shine your light upon this school of the prophets, the prophecy school that's coming, and that you can shine your light upon us as we seek your face. And we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.